What's the meaning of life? Now, that is a truly big one. It is probably the most important question that humanity has been asking itself ever since we were smart enough to contemplate the implications of our existence. Many answers to that question have already been given. They've been given in literature, prose, novels, philosophy. The answers to the question could also be made with respect to certain categories. From a biological perspective, the meaning of life is to consume and reproduce. Many may argue that the meaning is to survive and seek comfort. Many will argue that the meaning of life is to serve God, or to have children, or to live a good life, or to live a happy life, according to Dalai Lama, for instance. If we have to take a look at this question from an entirely default perspective and ask the most powerful computer in the universe what the meaning of life was, we would probably get an error message. This question itself might not only have an answer, but this question may not even be asked. We could be committing a category error just by asking the question. We could be attributing a property to the question by asking the actual question in the first place. Regardless, I would argue that there is no objective meaning to life, because there was never a universally outlined mandate given to humanity by the supreme ruler of the universe. However, that does not mean that there are no meanings in life. There are plenty of meanings in life. There are plenty of things to fix and improve. My argument is that the meaning of life is to reduce suffering and to live a productive life. There, pretty easy. Not. Many people would scoff at my suggestion. But would their immediate inclination to dismiss my suggestion be based on hurt feelings, feelings of imposed accountability, ego, or feelings of a necessary responsibility that we should have towards those who pay for our existence? Would their immediate inclination to scoff at my suggestion be based on some sort of a well thought out intellectual counter-argument? My suggestion entails a certain sacrifice, not in a religious sense, but in a purely mathematical sense. For instance, if you could make two people happy instead of one, then you should definitely do the former. If you could sacrifice yourself to save 100 people from the brutal death, then intellectually, you should realize that it would be the right thing to do. However, in the last moment, for the overwhelming majority of us, our feelings of self-preservation would probably get the best of us. But even in that split-second decision, even if that occurs, that does not defeat the simple mathematical equation of reducing suffering and avoiding unnecessary suffering and death if the benefits of the sacrifice outweigh the harm of not committing the sacrifice. But the truth is, we are not built on mathematical equations. We rarely think mathematics when it comes to the big subjects. I would argue that one of humanity's most major flaws lies in our need to serve ourselves or serve our close ones rather than to simply serve others. This is not a simple task. We are emotionally attached to our relatives and friends. As someone once said, what I should do to you, you should do to others. The specific implied action is that of a benign nature, of course. That way, theoretically speaking, there would be a certain chain of benign actions that would be causally transferred from one person to another. The to do no harm mentality is probably the most important mentality of all. We should be able to try to satisfy our insatiable desires and addictions without involving other sentient creatures. The equation for productive life should involve at least the least amount of suffering imposed on others. The most important thing in the universe is the capacity to feel pain. The capacity to feel pleasure is on the other side of this on the scale, so to speak, and all the other eccentric pleasures and satisfactions of our desires in life are located in the middle of the equation. However, since the capacity to feel pleasure can only be achieved if there is no unnecessary suffering endured, then the absence of the unnecessary suffering is the most important component in this life equation. And it does not matter who does the suffering, who is experiencing it. It could be your mother, or it could be someone on the other side of the planet. Let's say your close one had an unfortunate accident and has broken his or her leg. Now, let's say there's another person of whose existence you are never aware of, living on another continent. Let's say that that person also has his or her leg broken. Now, if you had the means to help one, who would you choose? The obvious and immediate resort of many would be to help the close one, simply because of our emotional attachment to that person. However, is it not true that in the end, both people are experiencing the same or very similar amount of suffering? If that is so, then we have to objectively admit that both people are worthy of help. Despite that, other secondary dilemmas may arise. Who has a better tolerance for pain? Who can handle the long and short-term effects of having a broken leg? Who will live a more productive life? Who would have to spend his or her life savings to treat the leg? If the broken leg does not cause infection and death, then who will be able to have a child who will be the next Adolf Hitler? Or who will be the one to whose child will be the next Albert Einstein? In the end, we simply do not know the answer. But does that mean that we should always act on our immediate emotional inclinations? I will refrain from arguing either pro or against this seemingly rhetorical question, but what I will argue for is that we can never discredit the benefits of the objective thinking that would broaden our scope of understanding of the implications of life. As I'm writing this sentence, as I'm speaking this sentence, I'm making you aware of all the suffering that goes on in the world. By writing the previous sentence, by arguing the previous sentence, I'm triggering a certain reaction in your brain that makes you have a few glimpses of the world's suffering. For some of you, it may be an animal being eaten alive. It may be a dying deer whose flesh was pierced by the poacher's arrow. It may be a starving child with a big round belly. It may be a gruesome disease, etc., etc. The sheer amount of suffering that goes on in the world right now is beyond anyone's comprehension. Let us not forget how much grotesque suffering it took from us for us to exist in the first place. And few people ever contemplate how much suffering billions or even trillions of sentient creatures had to endure before evolution produced the Homo sapiens. Think of all the sea creatures and of all the crawling land beasties that had to constantly look for food, seek comfort, produce and then die. If these beasties were quote unquote lucky and then they quote unquote made it and passed on their genes, they managed to play the game of life right. They were surrounded by the advantageous circumstances that enabled them to complete their program mission without being prematurely eaten by some other creature, which was governed by the same forces. The implication of all these creatures passing their genes into the future is you listening to me right now. The implication of all those creatures had to go through the 2 billion years for us to raise and kill cows and then make burgers out of them. But if all that suffering endured isn't past, if all that suffering experienced, but the tiniest, if all that suffering made the tiniest blip on the radar of the universe, then what about now? Is it still not the same thing? Is it still not the same zebra being eaten alive by a crocodile or alligator? Is it still not the same cancer cell eating out the insides of a person living a few thousand years ago? Is it not the same fish being ripped apart by a large predator? What we allow to take place right now is our responsibility because of our intelligence. And it would theoretically seem that we owe this responsibility to every single creature that had managed to survive for us to exist. But we had no choice in the matter. We had no say in whether we wanted to exist at all. That is why we cannot truly be held accountable for every little beastie that died in the jaw of its predator for the duration of 2 billion years. However, that does not excuse us from being apathetic and indifferent to the suffering that we do impose today. The most frequent counter-argument to the brutish nature of life is, well, it's natural, or that's the way it is, or life is not fair, or, well, what are you gonna do? Or, well, we still have to live, or, well, that is the survival of the fittest, or, well, we would not be here if it wasn't for all that, or God made it that way, or God knows best, or nature knows best, or simply get over it. The list goes on and on. There are no limits to the extent of people's ability to justify life no matter what. There is seemingly no excessive harm and destruction that befalls the sentient creatures every day that can trigger a significant thought in people's brains that would question the validity of life. On the contrary, according to the many, it is the gift of life. A large portion of those claiming that life is a gift come from the religious background. Indeed, the sanctity and the preciousness that are ascribed to life are of religious origin for the most part. However, if that argument is to be objectified, then even the smallest bacteria would fall into the sacred category. You will find that this is not so for the large proportion of the population. In most cases, the sanctity of life only applies to humans. All other life sentient creatures are excluded from the sacred club, out of hand. If I am not overtly picking the sacred life argument to pieces, then I am obviously pointing out the hypocrisy in this regard. I do not propose a narrowing down of the word sacred and its regard to Homo sapiens. I rather hope to provoke reasoning behind such a belief, both religious and secular. The religious reasoning is fairly easy to understand. The traditional God has created everything. He created the heavens, the beasties, and man. Man was God's finest creation. Man was to be the only being able to exercise free will. Man was to be God's center of attention and vice versa. Man was to be the ultimate tool for God to show his goodness. God could only show his goodness and greatness if he invented people to recognize and praise his goodness and greatness. Therefore, life is a gift from God because the initial implication of life was for people to be able to even comprehend God's existence.